The desert at Amarna does not hide its emptiness. It spreads it beneath the sun, pale and wind-combed, with low cliffs on one side and the green Nile in the distance. Here, where a king once tried to remake Egypt around a single blazing god, the ground still carries fragments of a vanished experiment, broken floors, faint streets, battered tombs, painted plaster, and ghost lines of temples that open directly to the light. Yet one presence refuses to fade. Her face survives in limestone and quartzite, in carved reliefs and painted fragments, in the memory of a blue crown and a long, elegant neck. Nefertiti is everywhere in the wreckage of Amarna, and still, at the most important point, she is nowhere. There is no confirmed tomb. There is no securely identified mummy. There is no final chamber where Egypt can say that the queen once called beautiful has come to rest. That absence is what gives her story its strange power. Many ancient rulers disappear because their images are smashed, their names are erased, or their monuments are buried beneath later ambitions. Nefertiti disappears differently. She remains visible enough to haunt the modern imagination, but missing enough to resist it. A queen who stood beside Akhenaten in Egypt's radical religious moment becomes, after a few years of prominence, a woman of broken clues. The record does not go silent all at once. It thins, it shifts, it hides behind altered names, reused objects, damaged inscriptions, uncertain mummies, and chambers that may or may not exist behind the walls of another king's tomb. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because Nefertiti's vanishing is not a simple missing person story. It is a story about how a royal world can be dismantled, repurposed, and buried beneath a more famous discovery. The place to begin is not in Berlin, where the most famous image of Nefertiti looks out from behind glass, and not even in the Valley of the Kings, where the search for her tomb still draws cameras, radar machines, and hopeful claims. It begins in Middle Egypt, at Akhenaten, the city now called Amarna. Akhenaten means the horizon of the Aten, and the name feels like a promise made to the sunrise. Akhenaten founded it in the 5th year of his reign, abandoning the old centres of power and carving proclamations into the desert cliffs that marked out the city's sacred territory. In that landscape, Nefertiti was not a background figure. She was shown again and again with the king, beneath the rays of the Aten, receiving life, performing ritual, wearing crowns, and appearing in scenes that make her look less like a silent consort than a partner in the visual language of rule. What survives in the record suggests that her visibility was unusual, even by the standards of royal women of the 18th dynasty, a period already rich with powerful queens. Earlier women such as Amos Nefertari, Hatshepsut, and Tia had shaped royal authority in ways Egypt could not easily forget. But Nefertiti's image belongs to a different atmosphere. Amarna art bends the old rules. Bodies stretch, faces lengthen, family scenes become intimate, and the royal couple appears under the sun disk with a directness that still feels startling. There are moments where Nefertiti smites enemies, a pose usually reserved for kings, and other moments where she carries out acts of worship with a prominence that seems almost sovereign. Scholars still debate how much political power these images represent, because Egyptian art is never a simple photograph of reality. It is ceremonial, symbolic, and carefully composed. Even so, the repetition matters. And then, against all this visibility, there is the silence of her end. The famous bust, found in 1912 in the workshop of the sculptor Thutmose at Amarna, gives the modern world a face so complete that it almost tricks the eye into believing the person herself is close. But the bust is also a warning. It is unfinished in one detail people often notice. Only after the beauty has already done its work, one eye lacks its inlay. The result is unsettling. Nefertiti seems both present and incomplete, preserved and withheld. Her face is among the best-known faces from antiquity, yet her body has never been securely found. Her name is commonly rendered as the beautiful one has come, but the record gives no equally clear answer to where she went. That contradiction has shaped more than a century of fascination. Archaeology has opened tombs, read letters, scanned mummies, reconstructed family trees, and turned ancient dust into genetic data. Egyptology has become more careful, more scientific, more suspicious of easy answers. Still, Nefertiti remains suspended between artifact and absence. Each generation receives a new possibility. Perhaps she died at Amarna and was buried in the royal tomb cut into the eastern cliffs. Perhaps her burial was disturbed when the old religion returned and Akhenaten's city was abandoned. Perhaps she became something more than queen, ruling under another name after Akhenaten's death. Perhaps she was reburied in the Valley of the Kings. Perhaps a mummy already known, damaged and unnamed, waits for better evidence. Or perhaps the traces that would have answered the question were destroyed in antiquity, not out of hatred for her personally, but as part of the political need to close the Amarna episode and restore Egypt's older order. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is not just a gap, it is part of the historical event itself. After Akhenaten, Egypt had reasons to forget. The Aten experiment had offended deep institutions, priesthoods, temples, cities, traditions, and the invisible machinery that made kingship seem eternal. When the restoration came, it reoriented memory. Names could be removed from lists. Images could be hacked away. Stone blocks from abandoned buildings could be reused in later monuments, their original scenes hidden inside walls. Objects made for one royal burial could be adapted for another. In such a world, disappearance is not always a single moment. It can be a slow administrative act, a quiet recycling of sacred material, a generation of scribes deciding which names deserve to remain in the official story. This is why Nefertiti's missing tomb is larger than a treasure hunt. It is tempting to imagine the mystery as a sealed doorway, a golden room, a final dramatic discovery waiting behind plaster or stone. But her vanishing may not be hidden in one chamber. It may be scattered across Amarna's ruined streets, the royal wadi's unfinished cuts, the damaged art of a rejected revolution, the altered funerary equipment of a boy king, and the long afterlife of a face carried far from Egypt. No single explanation fully accounts for this, because the disappearance of Nefertiti sits at the crossing point of archaeology, politics, religion, family succession, and modern desire. So the story begins with a paradox carved into dust and light. At Amarna, the sun still rises over the cliffs as it did when Akhenaten's city was new, and the empty spaces seem almost too wide for the briefness of the dream they once held. Nefertiti stands at the center of that dream, radiant in image, powerful in gesture, and yet absent at the end. She is not lost because history forgot her completely. She is lost because history remembered her unevenly. It preserved the face and misplaced the ending. It kept the queen in gold, paint, and stone, but withheld the body, the tomb, and the final sentence. To follow her disappearance, we have to enter the world that made her visible first, the older Egypt that stood behind Amarna, and the forces that gathered around a royal woman before she became the most beautiful absence in ancient history. long before Nefertiti becomes the face of a vanished queen. Egypt is already an old civilization looking at itself through layers of sacred habit. By the time she appears in the royal record, the pyramids of Giza have stood for more than 1,000 years. Kings have risen and fallen, foreign rulers have been expelled, temples have grown into great estates, and the Nile has kept its slow annual rhythm beneath all the noise of dynasties. The world that produces Nefertiti is not a young kingdom searching for identity. It is an imperial state at the height of confidence, rich from conquest, anchored by ritual, and convinced that order itself depends on the proper relationship between the king, the gods, the temples, and the land. To understand how shocking Amarna would become, it helps to see the world before the shock, when Egypt's power looks immense, polished, and almost immovable. The 18th dynasty is one of Egypt's great ages of expansion. Its kings inherit the memory of liberation after the Hyksos period and transform that memory into empire. Armies move beyond the traditional borders. Gold comes from Nubia, tribute arrives from Western Asia, and foreign princes write to the Egyptian court with gifts, requests, anxieties, and diplomatic flattery. The pharaoh is not only ruler of the two lands, he is presented as the living point where cosmic order touches earth. The idea of Ma'at, the balance of truth, justice, rightness, and proper order, is not an abstract philosophy kept by scholars. It is the central grammar of kingship. The king feeds the gods sustain Egypt, and Egypt, in turn, flourishes under the king. This is how the system describes itself. What daily life felt like beneath it was more complicated, of course, but the ideology was powerful, and it was everywhere. The temples are not just places of prayer, they are economic and political institutions, with land, workshops, storage rooms, priests, scribes, musicians, gardeners, herdsmen, bakers, boatmen, and enormous administrative reach. A major temple is a sacred machine, and few machines are more important than the cult of Amun at Thebes. Amun, whose name suggests hiddenness, rises in prominence during the New Kingdom until his priesthood stands close to the centre of royal wealth. The great temple complex at Karnak grows through the patronage of kings who wish to anchor their legitimacy in stone. Each pylon, obelisk, court, and shrine becomes part of a sacred conversation between ruler and god. Kings give to Amun, and Amun gives kingship back to them in divine form. It is not difficult to imagine why a later attempt to push Amun aside would disturb more than theology. It would disturb property, status, ritual calendars, family traditions, and the political balance between palace and priesthood. Before Akhenaten's revolution, the court is shaped by the long reign of Amenhotep III, one of the most magnificent rulers of ancient Egypt. His reign is remembered not for desperate conquest but for display, diplomacy, building, and the careful projection of royal splendour. Colossal statues rise, palaces glitter, scarabs are issued to announce royal events across the realm. Foreign marriages and diplomatic exchanges knit Egypt into a wider Late Bronze Age world where Babylon, Mitanni, Hatti, Assyria, and smaller Levantine states all watch one another with interest and suspicion. Egypt is wealthy enough to turn kingship into spectacle. Amenhotep III can be shown as a dazzling solar ruler, a living god in his Jubilee festivals, a king whose body and authority are renewed in ritual. What survives in the record suggests that his reign helped create an atmosphere where solar imagery became especially intense, and where royal divinity was staged with unusual brilliance. At the centre of that earlier court stands Queen Tiye, mother of Akhenaten and one of the most formidable royal women of the period, Tia is not a shadow behind her husband. Her name appears in diplomacy. Her image appears beside the king. Foreign rulers know her importance. She belongs to the tradition of 18th dynasty queens who could wield influence in ways both visible and subtle. This matters because Nefertiti does not emerge into a world where queens are decorative afterthoughts. She emerges after generations in which royal women could embody legitimacy, dynastic continuity, divine association, and diplomatic intelligence. Still, Nefertiti's later prominence would go beyond familiar patterns. Tia helps explain how a queen could matter. Nefertiti will show how far that visibility might be stretched under new religious conditions. The young prince who becomes Akhenaten is born into this world of immense inherited order. His original name is Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, a name that ties him to the very god his later reign will marginalize. The irony is almost too neat, but history often permits ironies that fiction would be accused of inventing. As Amenhotep IV, he comes to the throne after a period still debated by scholars. Some argue there may have been a co-regency with his father Amenhotep III. Others remain cautious, because the evidence does not settle every detail. What matters for the unfolding story is that the new king inherits a kingdom of wealth, temples, international connections, and carefully balanced religious power. He does not begin with ruins. He begins with abundance. That makes the later rupture more striking. The god who will dominate his reign, the Aten, is not invented from nothing. The Aten, the visible disk of the sun, already exists in Egyptian religious language before Akhenaten. Solar worship is ancient in Egypt, and the sun has long been connected with kingship, rebirth, creation, and daily cosmic renewal. The difference is not that Akhenaten notices the sun. Many Egyptians had done that for centuries, and the Nile Valley gives the sun little chance to be ignored. The difference is the narrowing. Under Akhenaten, the Aten becomes the focus of an increasingly exclusive royal theology, and access to divine blessing is mediated through the royal family in a new and striking way. The change does not happen in one breath. It intensifies over time. In the early reign, there are still traces of older forms. Then names shift, images change, temples to the Aten rise, and eventually the king changes his own name from Amenhotep to Akhenaten, often understood as effective for the Aten or useful to the Aten. Nefertiti appears at the heart of this transformation, but her origins remain uncertain. She may have been connected to powerful court families. Some have suggested links to Ai, who later becomes king, though the exact relationship is still debated. She may have had a sister named Mutbenret, known from Amarna scenes, but the surviving evidence is not generous enough to give a full biography before queenship. No secure inscription tells us the simple modern facts people want where she was born. What her childhood was like, how she was chosen, what private education shaped her, or what she thought of the religious changes around her. Ancient Egypt preserved names, titles, and ritual images more readily than inner lives. The evidence remains incomplete, and so Nefertiti enters history already partly veiled. Yet even that veiled entrance is dramatic because of the stage on which she appears. Egypt before the disappearance is not merely background, it is the structure her life will strain against. The old gods are powerful, the temples are wealthy, the royal house is internationally connected. The memory of past kings weighs heavily on the present. Every act of ritual, every crown, every carved scene, every offering table is part of a system built to make continuity seem eternal. When Nefertiti rises beside Akhenaten, She does so inside a civilization that prizes endurance above almost everything. Her later vanishing will become so haunting because it happens in a culture obsessed with preservation. Egypt builds for forever, writes for forever, mummifies for forever, and repeats names so the dead can live. And still, somehow, the queen whose image once blazed across a new sacred city slips beyond the certainty of the record, leaving behind the first great question of her life, not how such a woman could be remembered, but how a world so devoted to memory could fail to tell us where she ended. Nefertiti enters the record not as a girl with a childhood, but as a queen already standing beside a king who is beginning to change Egypt's religious weather. This is one of the first frustrations in following her life. The ancient evidence does not open with a birth, a family house, a private name whispered in youth, or a clear explanation of how she entered the royal household. It presents her in the formal grammar of power. She is the great royal wife, the chief queen of Amenhotep IV, soon to be Akhenaten, and from the beginning she is not tucked discreetly behind him. She is placed where the eye must meet her. She appears in temple scenes, on blocks, in reliefs, under the rays of the Aten, with the king in acts of devotion. The record does not tell us everything we want to know, but it does tell us that the new reign makes her visible with remarkable force. Her name is itself almost theatrical in its elegance. Nefertiti is often translated as the beautiful one has come, or the beautiful woman has arrived. Later she is associated with the longer name Neferuata Nefertiti, layering her identity more explicitly with the Aten's beauty and radiance. Names in Egypt are not decorative labels. They carry religious and political meaning. A royal name can place a person inside a divine story. For Nefertiti, the name seems to do exactly what her images do. It makes a rival into destiny. Yet the more polished the name becomes, the more noticeable the gaps around it appear. Scholars still debate her parentage. One possibility connects her to the powerful courtier Ai, who later becomes king, but the evidence does not make that relationship certain. Another suggestion once looked toward foreign origins, partly because the idea of a queen arriving invited speculation, but this remains unsupported by firm evidence. What survives in the record suggests a woman deeply embedded in the Egyptian court, but the doorway through which she entered remains partly closed. The title Great Royal Wife matters because it is both familiar and charged. Egypt had long known queens who stood close to power, but the role was not identical in every reign. A chief queen could bear royal children, appear in ritual, support dynastic legitimacy, and embody divine femininity in relation to the king. She could also become much more than that when circumstances allowed. Tyre, before Nefertiti, had already shown that a queen could be politically important and internationally recognized. Hatshepsut had gone further still, becoming king in her own right generations earlier. Nefertiti inherits this landscape of possibility, but she enters it under stranger conditions. Akhenaten's religious vision increasingly centers divine access on the royal family itself. If the Aten's life-giving rays flow most directly to king and queen, then the queen is not merely a wife in the palace. She becomes part of the visible channel through which sacred life reaches Egypt. This helps explain why the early images of Nefertiti feel so bold. In some of the scenes associated with Akhenaten's early building activity, especially at Karnak before the move to Amarna, she appears in a scale and prominence that would have been difficult to ignore. The greater 10 temples of the early reign were built with small standardized blocks now known as talatat, a lesser-known but crucial detail in the story of Amarna. These blocks were easy to carry, easy to assemble, and, as later history proved, easy to dismantle and reuse. Many were eventually buried inside later constructions after the Amarna period was rejected. From these scattered stones, Egyptologists have pieced together fragments of a world that later kings tried to hide in plain sight. Nefertiti appears on some of these blocks with striking regularity, and her presence in this early material suggests that her prominence was not a later invention created only at Amarna. It was there as the revolution was taking shape. The images are not always gentle. One of the most surprising aspects of Nefertiti's iconography is that she can appear in the classic pose of royal domination, smiting enemies. This pose belongs to one of Egypt's oldest visual traditions. The king raises a weapon over defeated foes, embodying the victory of order over chaos. For a queen to occupy that visual position is extraordinary. It does not necessarily mean Nefertiti personally led troops or acted as a battlefield commander. Egyptian art often speaks in symbols rather than literal reportage, but the symbolism itself is powerful. It gives her a king-like function in the religious political imagination of the reign. She becomes not only beautiful, fertile, and sacred, but also active in defending cosmic order. No single image can prove the full shape of her authority, yet repeated imagery of this kind makes it difficult to reduce her to ornament. Her crowns tell a similar story. Nefertiti wears forms of headdress that distinguish her immediately: the famous tall, flat-topped blue crown known from the Berlin bust, but also other royal and divine headgear in reliefs. Crowns in Egypt are instruments of meaning. They identify status, ritual identity, divine association, and sometimes roles usually attached to kingship. In Nefertiti's case, her headgear helps create a recognizable public persona. She is not one queen among many interchangeable figures. She is staged as a specific royal force, a visual counterpart to Akhenaten in the new sacred order. The artistic language makes her legible from a distance, even in fragmentary form: a face, a crown, a posture beneath the Aten's rays, and suddenly the queen is there again, assembled from broken evidence. At the same time, it is important not to mistake visibility for clarity. Egyptian royal art is persuasive by design. It shows what power wants to say about itself. Nefertiti may have been immensely influential, but the images do not reveal the mechanisms of that influence. They do not show us cabinet meetings, private arguments, administrative decisions, or the Queen's own voice. They show ritual action. They show ideology. They show a court presenting itself to gods, subjects, and perhaps to eternity. The evidence remains incomplete, and the historian has to stand between two errors underestimating Nefertiti, because she was a woman in a king-centered society, and overclaiming certainty because her images are so magnificent. The safest conclusion is also the most intriguing one. The regime needed her to be seen, and that need becomes more significant as Akhenaten's reign turns away from older patterns. The king's relationship to the Aten grows increasingly central, but Nefertiti is not pushed out by that narrowing focus. She is drawn into it. The rays of the Aten often end in tiny hands, holding signs of life toward the faces of the royal pair. The old hidden god Amun recedes, the visible sun disk shines. The royal family becomes the sacred spectacle through which divine favor is displayed. In such a system, Nefertiti's body, crown, name, and gestures acquire public theological weight. She's not merely married to the man changing Egypt. She's part of how that change is made visible. This is the first great layer of her later disappearance. Nefertiti vanishes from certainty only after being made almost impossible to ignore. She is not an obscure queen whose tomb is missing because she barely entered the record. She is a queen who stood in the brightest part of a new royal theatre. with her image repeated across temples and city walls, her identity bound to the Aten's beauty. Her role expanded until it presses against the limits of queenship itself. The woman beside Akhenaten is already more than a consort, though exactly how much more remains debated. She is the elegant surface of a political and religious transformation, and perhaps also one of its working engines. When the story moves toward Akhenaten, the city built for the sun, it carries Nefertiti not as a side figure but as one of the central faces of the experiment. Akhenaten rises from a decision that feels almost impossible in a civilization so devoted to inherited places. Egypt's sacred geography is old, crowded, and layered with memory. Thebes has Amun, Memphis has Ptah, Heliopolis has the deep solar traditions of Ra. Abydos has the presence of Osiris and the dead. Every important city carries gods, priesthoods, festivals, estates, tombs, and stories that reach backward into the foundations of kingship. Akhenaten chooses to step outside that density. He does not merely renovate a temple or promote a favorite god inside an existing city. He orders new capital to be born on a stretch of desert and riverbank that he presents as untouched, a place belonging to no old deity, no old cult, and no priesthood whose claims might rival the Aten. The move is practical, theological, and theatrical all at once. It is also risky in a way Egypt rarely likes to be risky. The new city sits in a broad bay of land on the east bank of the Nile, held between the river and the cliffs. Akhenaten marks it with boundary stelae carved into the surrounding rock, declaring the sacred limits of the Aten's horizon. These inscriptions are more than formal proclamations. They are the city's birth certificate, its religious charter, and its warning label. The king states that the Aten himself has chosen this place, and that Akhenaten will build here for his god. He also speaks of tombs, temples, and royal burials, hints that matter deeply later because they suggest that Amarna was not meant to be a temporary courtly experiment. It was designed as a new centre of life and death. What survives in the record suggests intention on a grand scale, though scholars still debate how fully that intention was realised before the city was abandoned. The speed of construction must have been astonishing. Officials, sculptors, priests of the new order, soldiers, guards, craftsmen, labourers, scribes, servants, and families connected to the court moved into a landscape that had to become a capital almost at once. Streets, palaces, temples, workshops, magazines, administrative buildings, and elite villas spread along the plain. The city was not built like a modern planned capital with perfect geometry, but it was shaped by royal urgency. The broad royal road allowed the king and queen to move in procession between palace zones and temples, turning the city itself into a stage. The Aten was not hidden in a dark sanctuary at the back of a roof temple. His worship took place in open courts, under the actual sun, with offering tables exposed to light. This is one of the most striking differences between Amarna and older temple traditions. In many Egyptian temples, sacred space becomes more restricted, darker, and more secret as one moves inward. At Akhenaten, the theology demands exposure. The god is visible, blazing overhead, and the temple architecture opens itself to him. This changes the emotional atmosphere of worship. The Aten is represented not as a falcon-headed figure, a human-shaped god, or a divine animal, but as the sun disk extending rays that end in little hands, some holding the ankh of life. It is a radical simplification of divine image, though not necessarily a simple religion in the modern sense. The Aten's power is universal, life-giving, and immediate, shining on Egypt and foreign lands alike. yet access to that god is tightly focused through Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Ordinary Egyptians do not seem to approach the Aten in the old way, through a rich world of divine personalities and local cults. The royal family becomes the central mediator. In art, the Aten gives life to the king and queen, and they, in turn, offer to the Aten. The people see the royal pair as the visible hinge between Earth and the solar source of life. No single explanation fully accounts for how this worked in practice, because public theology and private religion do not always match neatly. But the official vision is clear enough: the sun shines, the royal family receives, and Egypt is meant to reorder itself around that exchange. Daily elite life in Akhenaten must have carried both luxury and unease. The great houses of officials could be spacious, with reception rooms, storage areas, servants' quarters, garden spaces, painted walls, and domestic shrines. Some houses included small chapels or areas where the royal family and Aten could be honoured, reminding us that even private devotion was being reshaped by the new ideology. Food, textiles, perfumes, metalwork, carved furniture, and imported goods moved through elite households. Scribes kept records, artists worked in studios, officials managed supplies and correspondence, bakers and brewers sustained the city's appetite. The court still needed the ordinary machinery of an Egyptian capital, no matter how heavenly its slogan sounded. A religion of sunlight still required mud brick, grain, water jars, cattle, laundry, sandals, and people to sweep the dust. A lesser-known detail gives the city an especially human texture. Amarna has preserved traces of artistic workshops where sculptors experimented with royal images on a scale rarely available elsewhere. The workshop associated with the sculptor Thutmose, where the famous bust of Nefertiti was found, contained not only finished beauty but studies, trial pieces, and models. This matters because Amarna art was not simply strange by accident. It was crafted, practiced, adjusted, and taught. The elongated faces, narrow shoulders, swelling bodies, intimate family gestures, and fluid lines belong to a visual program that artists had to learn. The style can look almost personal, as though the court suddenly allowed realism to break through. But that impression is deceptive. Amarna art is just as ideological as earlier Egyptian art, only its ideology has changed. It wants bodies to proclaim a new kind of sacred life, one softened, stretched, and illuminated by the Aten. Akhenaten himself is shown in forms that have provoked centuries of speculation: long face, full lips, narrow eyes, soft belly, wide hips, and a body that does not fit older heroic conventions. Some older theories try to diagnose him from art alone, proposing medical conditions or unusual biology, but such claims remain uncertain and often go beyond the evidence. The safer reading is that the king's altered body is part of a new visual theology, a way of making the royal form strange enough to belong to the Aten's transformed world. Nefertiti's image participates in this same artistic revolution, though with a different balance of elegance and authority. Together, king and queen become the living icons of the city. Yet Amarna is not only a dream of a light, it is also a controlled environment. The new capital pulls power away from older religious centres and gathers it around the king's vision. Officials who prosper there do so under the Aten's shadow, which is to say under Akhenaten's. Their tombs in the cliffs praise the king and the god in language that often feels intensely focused on royal favour. Their careers depend on the new order, and their afterlife scenes show them receiving rewards from the palace. The city's elite population lives close to power, but closeness can be a form of exposure. When a reign is built around one king's revelation, the fate of many people becomes tied to the durability of that revelation. For Nefertiti, Akhenaten is the great stage on which her public identity reaches its highest brightness. The city's temples need her presence. Its art repeats her importance. Its religious grammar makes her part of the Aten's visible relationship with Egypt. She is not merely living in the capital. She's one of the forms through which the capital explains itself. The sunlit experiment gives her a kind of immortality in image, but it also places her memory inside a fragile political structure. If Amarna stands, she stands at its heart. If Amarna falls, her record becomes vulnerable to the same dismantling that will overtake the city's temples, names, and sacred claims. For the moment, however, the horizon still shines. The offering tables fill, the rays descend. The royal road carries the spectacle of a new Egypt through dust and brightness, and Nefertiti moves within it, as though the future has been rewritten in light. The image of Nefertiti survives with a precision that feels almost unnatural. After the dust of Akhenaten, after the abandoned temples and broken Talatat blocks, after the dismantling of a religious revolution that Egypt later preferred not to remember, one face seems to have escaped the collapse. The famous bust is not large in the way a colossal statue is large. It does not overwhelm by size, it overwhelms by poise. The tall blue crown lifts the head into a form both human and ceremonial. The neck rises with an elegance that has become inseparable from the modern idea of Nefertiti. The cheekbones, lips, brows, and painted surface create a face so controlled that it seems less like a portrait than a royal spell. And yet the object that made her immortal also makes her harder to know. It gives the world a face, but not a life. It gives beauty, but not certainty. It gives presence, but not an ending. The bust was found in the early 20th century at Amarna, in a sculptor's workshop associated with Thutmose. That context matters as much as the beauty itself. This was not a tomb discovery. It was not a funerary mask lifted from a sealed chamber. It was found among the tools and remains of image-making, among objects that belong to the process of shaping royal appearance. The workshop setting suggests that the bust may have functioned as a model, a master image, or a reference for other representations of the Queen. Scholars still debate the exact purpose, and the evidence remains incomplete. But it is clear that this was not an ordinary household object. It belonged to the world where royal identity was carefully manufactured, repeated, and controlled. Nefertiti's beauty, in this sense, was not simply observed. It was produced as a language of power. One of the most arresting details is the missing left eye inlay. The right eye is complete and alive with dark precision. The left is blank, pale, and unfinished. This absence has invited speculation for generations. Was the bust abandoned before completion? Was the eye never inserted because the object had a workshop purpose rather than a final display function? Was the missing eye lost after discovery or in antiquity? There is no need to turn the detail into melodrama for it to feel haunting. The effect is already powerful enough. Nefertiti looks complete from a distance, but incomplete when the gaze settles. It is almost too perfect a metaphor for her place in history, one side vividly preserved, the other withheld. The bust has shaped modern imagination so strongly that it can distort the ancient evidence around it. Once a face becomes iconic, people begin to read the life backward from the image. They imagine personality from symmetry, authority from posture, serenity from stillness. But Egyptian royal art does not work like an unguarded photograph. It is not a private expression of mood. It is an official construction, and Amarna's official construction is especially unusual. The face of Nefertiti is therefore both evidence and invention. It tells us what her court wanted her to look like within a sacred visual system. It does not tell us how often she smiled, how she spoke, how she made decisions, whether she supported every detail of Akhenaten's religious program, or how she understood her own power. What survives in the record suggests a queen of exceptional prominence, but no carved cheekbone can substitute for a biography. Still, the bust is only one part of the surviving image. Nefertiti appears across Amarna in reliefs, statues, fragments, and temple scenes. In these, her beauty is not always calm. Sometimes it is ritualized, sometimes maternal, sometimes severe, sometimes almost kingly. She stands with Akhenaten beneath the Aten's rays. She presents offerings. She rides in ceremonial movement. She appears with her daughters in scenes of royal intimacy that would have seemed striking beside older, more formal traditions. In some images, she sits close to the king in a way that presents the royal household as the living centre of the new religion. In others, as earlier glimpsed, she takes on the violent symbolic posture of smiting Egypt's enemies, a scene less about battlefield realism than about the queen's participation in royal domination over chaos. The range of imagery complicates the simple idea of Nefertiti as merely beautiful. Beauty was part of her public identity, but it was not the whole of it. In Egyptian thought, beauty could carry sacred force. It could suggest harmony, divine favour, youth, renewal, and the proper shining condition of royal life. The word Nefer itself carries meanings of beauty, goodness, completion, and perfection. A beautiful queen was not just visually pleasing. She could embody the ordered radiance the court wanted to project. In Amarna, where the Aten's light gives life to the royal family, Nefertiti's beauty becomes theological. Her face and body help express the idea that the sun's blessing has made the royal household uniquely alive. This is why the famous face must be placed back inside its religious world. Removed from Amarna, the bust can look like a timeless masterpiece, floating above politics. Inside Amarna, it becomes more dangerous and more interesting. It belongs to a regime that is rewriting divine access. It belongs to a city that has made the royal family into the central spectacle of cosmic renewal. It belongs to an artistic style that stretches the body away from older ideals and toward a new sacred strangeness. Even the elegance of Nefertiti's features must be understood as part of a program, not merely a record of private appearance. No single explanation fully accounts for the power of the image, because it is at once art, theology, propaganda, memory, and accident of survival. Accident matters. So much of ancient history depends on what happened to endure. The bust survived not because Egypt decided to preserve Nefertiti's memory kindly, but because it remained in a workshop in a city later abandoned and buried. Many of her other images were broken, reused, or hidden inside later structures when Amarna was dismantled. Talatat blocks from Aten temples were taken apart and packed into building projects elsewhere, sometimes with their carved faces concealed for millennia. This creates a strange archaeological afterlife. The very effort to erase or repurpose Amarna helped preserve fragments of it. Later builders were not trying to honour Nefertiti when they reused blocks bearing her image. Yet their practical recycling trapped pieces of her world inside stone, waiting for modern scholars to recognise them. The result is a queen preserved in fragments of intention and accident. Her official images were designed to make her visible, but their survival depends on abandonment, reuse, burial, and rediscovery. The modern world often meets her through one polished face in a museum, but Egyptologists meet her through broken reliefs, damaged inscriptions, scattered blocks, and uncertain contexts. This difference matters because the popular Nefertiti can seem almost too complete, while the historical Nefertiti is made of partial evidence. Her face is famous enough to feel familiar, but familiarity is not knowledge. The beauty draws the viewer close, and then the record steps back. There is also the problem of modern desire. Nefertiti's bust became an object of fascination not only because it is beautiful, but because it seemed to offer a perfect queen at the edge of a perfect mystery. Her image has been used in art, fashion, politics, tourism, museum debates, and arguments over cultural heritage. The question of where the bust belongs, in Berlin or returned to Egypt, adds another layer to her story. Nefertiti is not only a vanished queen from antiquity. She's a modern symbol whose face is still claimed, defended, displayed, and contested. That afterlife can make the missing tomb feel even more urgent. The world possesses her image, but not her body. It has made her into an icon, but the ancient end of her life remains unresolved. And so the immortal face does not solve Nefertiti's disappearance. It deepens it. The bust says she mattered. The reliefs say she stood close to sacred power. The temple scenes say she was woven into the official heart of Akhenaten's revolution. But none of them tell us where she was buried, when she died, whether she changed her name, whether she ruled, or whether her body was moved after Amarna fell. The more vividly Nefertiti survives in art, the stranger her final absence becomes. Egypt gave her a face that could cross more than 3,000 years. Then history took away the chamber where that face should have rested. Power at Amarna does not sit in the shadows. It is staged in sunlight, repeated in stone, painted into palace walls, and carried along the royal road in ceremonial motion. In older Egyptian tradition, much of divine authority gathers around hidden sanctuaries, veiled cult statues, restricted priestly spaces, and rituals most people never see directly. Akhenaten's world reverses that emotional logic. The Aten shines openly, and the royal family becomes the visible center of worship. That visibility gives Nefertiti a role more intense than the familiar dignity of a chief queen. She's not simply near the throne, she's displayed as part of the mechanism through which the throne receives and returns divine life. Her power, whatever its exact administrative limits, is made public with unusual insistence. The first evidence lies in repetition. A single royal scene can be symbolic, ceremonial, or even exceptional. But Nefertiti appears again and again in positions of ritual importance. She offers to the Aten. She stands beside Akhenaten at the center of sacred action. She receives the sun's rays ending in tiny hands that hold the sign of life. She appears with the king in scenes where the distinction between political authority and divine service becomes difficult to separate. In Egyptian ideology, the king's primary role is to maintain Mat by serving the gods, defeating chaos, and sustaining the cosmic order. When Nefertiti is shown participating so prominently in that work, the images do not simply flatter her, they place her inside the visible performance of kingship. This does not mean she was king in the straightforward sense, at least not during the earlier part of Akhenaten's reign. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how far her formal authority extended. Egyptian queens could appear in ritual without ruling as pharaoh. Images could magnify a queen's sacred importance, while leaving political administration in the hands of the king and his officials. But Nefertiti's Amarna prominence sits at the far edge of what queenship usually allowed. The sheer number of her appearances, her scale beside the king, her independent ritual action, and her occasional adoption of king-like imagery suggest a role that was not merely ceremonial decoration. What survives in the record suggests that the Amarna state needed her as an active sacred partner. Her titles help deepen the impression. Nefertiti is not only great royal wife, she bears names and epithets that bind her to the Aten's beauty, to royal favour, and to the living presence of the king. In Amarna theology, the royal couple becomes the central human expression of divine light. Akhenaten is unique, but he is rarely alone in the imagery. Nefertiti stands as the feminine counterpart through whom the royal household acquires balance, fertility, and sacred completeness. The Aten may be abstract and solar, but the worship of the Aten is intensely embodied in the king, queen, and their daughters. This makes Nefertiti's presence more than personal prestige. It gives the revolution a family form, a living icon the population can see. The famous scenes of the royal family under the Aten are often remembered for tenderness. Parents holding daughters, touching faces, appearing in intimate arrangements that feel almost domestic. Yet those scenes are not private snapshots. They are political theology. The family's affection, fertility, and closeness become signs that the Aten's life flows properly through the royal house. Nefertiti's motherhood is therefore not merely a biological fact. It becomes part of the sacred display of continuity. The daughters shown beneath the rays are not background children in a palace album. They are participants in the image of a divinely favoured dynasty. Their presence must be treated carefully and without modern sentimental overreach. But their artistic role is clear. They help make the royal family itself into a temple-like body. Nefertiti's power also appears in the unusual way she can be separated from Akhenaten and still act with authority. Some scenes show her worshipping or performing gestures in a manner that gives her visual independence. Others place her in poses long associated with the king's control over foreign enemies. The smiting image remains one of the strongest clues. For thousands of years, Egyptian kings used the image of striking down foes to announce their defense of order. When Nefertiti takes that posture, the court is borrowing one of the deepest symbols of pharaonic power and allowing the queen to inhabit it. No one should read such art too literally. It is not a battlefield report, but symbolic language is never meaningless. In a world where images help create reality, to show the queen performing royal domination is to enlarge what queenship can mean. This enlargement may have served a practical political purpose. Akhenaten's religious changes disrupted old centres of authority. If the Aten's worship was tightly focused through the king, then the stability of the new cult depended heavily on the royal household's visibility and continuity. Nefertiti may have helped stabilize a reign that was otherwise pulling against tradition. Her beauty, ritual action, fertility, and public partnership with Akhenaten gave the new religion a second royal pillar. The old gods had families, myths, relationships, and emotional textures. The Aten, as official art presents him, is more abstract a disk, rays, light, life. The human family around the Aten may have supplied some of the relational warmth and sacred drama that the god's simplified image lacked. There is also the question of court politics. Amarna's officials praise the king, receive rewards from the palace, and build their careers under the new order. In such a court, access matters. A queen positioned so close to Akhenaten's ritual and visual authority may also have held influence over appointments, favours, ceremonies, and household networks. Direct proof is limited, because Egyptian records rarely describe the backstage operations of royal women with the clarity modern historians would like. But queens often exercise power through kinship, patronage, property, religious office, and proximity to the ruler. Nefertiti's extraordinary public role makes private insignificance unlikely, even if the exact shape of her influence remains debated. Foreign diplomacy adds another shadowy dimension. The Amarna letters, the cache of diplomatic correspondence found in the ruins of the city, reveal a late Bronze Age world of anxious kings, vassal rulers, gift exchanges, marriages, and complaints. These tablets do not give Nefertiti the kind of personal diplomatic profile that Queen Tia seems to have enjoyed in the preceding generation, but they place her within a court deeply entangled with international politics, gold, brides, statues, chariots, lapis lazuli, and urgent pleas move through the royal system. Egypt's image abroad depended on the strength and continuity of the palace. Nefertiti's public role as chief queen, mother of royal daughters, and sacred partner would have mattered in how that continuity was imagined. Even when the surviving letters do not let her speak directly, the more one studies her prominence, the more her later disappearance becomes unsettling. It is one thing for a minor figure to slip out of the record. It is another for a woman built into the visual heart of a religious revolution to become uncertain at the end. The state that elevated her did not casually forget how to carve her face. It had filled walls with her importance. It had made her part of the Aten's shining order, so when her trail grows difficult, the difficulty feels historical rather than accidental. Something changes in the final years of Amarna, whether death, political transformation, renamed authority, deliberate erasure, or a combination of events now blurred by damaged evidence. For the moment, however, Nefertiti stands at the height of visibility. She is the queen behind the solar throne only if behind means beside, within, and sometimes almost before it. She is part of the public machinery of sacred rule, one of the central bodies through which Akhenaten's Egypt explains itself. Her authority cannot be measured like a modern office, with a neat list of duties and powers. It has to be read through scale, gesture, title, repetition, and context, and those clues, though incomplete, point toward a woman whose role was deliberately expanded until she became inseparable from the Amarna vision itself. The sunlit experiment did not simply include Nefertiti, it needed her radiance to make itself believable. The royal family at Amarna is not hidden behind palace walls in the way one might expect from an ancient court. It is displayed with a directness that still feels strange, even after more than a century of study. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters appear together beneath the rays of the Aten, not as distant symbols arranged in stiff separation, but as a household made sacred by visibility. The scenes are intimate without being private. A daughter sits on a royal lap. A parent lifts a small face close. Hands reach, bodies lean, and the sun's rays descend over the group like lines of divine breath. To modern eyes, these images can seem tender, almost domestic, and in some ways they are. But they are also official religious art. They turn family closeness into theology. At Amarna, the royal household becomes one of the main ways Egypt is asked to understand the new god. This is one of the most important differences between Akhenaten's revolution and older royal display. Earlier Egyptian art certainly showed royal families, queens, heirs, and divine birth scenes, but Amarna makes the living royal household unusually central. The Aten is not surrounded by a crowded mythological world of divine relatives, animal forms, and local cult stories. The god is a disk, a source of light, a visible power in the sky. The human family beneath him supplies the emotional structure. Akhenaten, and Nefertiti do not merely worship the Aten, they embody the human side of his radiance. Their daughters, shown under the same rays, extend that sacred household into dynastic continuity. What survives in the record suggests that the royal family was presented almost as a living icon, the place where divine life could be seen touching flesh. Nefertiti and Akhenaten had 6 known daughters: Meritaten, Meketeten, Ankhesenpaten, Neferneferuaten Tasherit, Neferneferura, and Setepenre. Their names themselves carry the imprint of the new religion, especially through the repeated presence of the Aten. These princesses appear in art at different ages and in different combinations, and their visibility helps date and interpret parts of the Amarna sequence. Yet the evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact chronology of some royal events, including the later fates and roles of the daughters. In the official imagery, they are not presented as independent political actors in the modern sense. They are shown as protected members of the sacred household, signs of fertility, continuity, and divine favour. Their presence is brief in the great sweep of Egyptian history, but at Amarna it becomes visually powerful. The household scenes have a softness that can easily mislead. They tempt the viewer to imagine that Amarna was simply more natural, more honest, more affectionate than earlier Egypt. This is possible in some limited human sense. Royal families, after all, were made of real people with real attachments. But the images are still carefully composed. Their intimacy is a public language. The royal family's closeness becomes a proof of blessing, just as their offerings become a proof of piety. If the Aten's light sustains all life, then the royal family must appear overflowing with life. If the new religion depends on the king and queen as mediators, then their family must look chosen, radiant, and harmonious. Even the affectionate gestures may carry political weight. They say that the new order is not barren doctrine. It is alive in bodies, names, births, and relationships. Court life around this sacred family must have been both splendid and tense. Amarna was a capital built quickly, and capitals are not only monuments, they are systems of dependency. Officials had to live near the king's vision. Artists had to learn the new style. Priests of the Aten had to perform rites in open courts. Scribes had to manage supplies, letters, workers, lands, and offerings. Servants moved through elite houses with water, linen, food, cosmetics, and furniture. Musicians, fan-bearers, guards, chariot handlers, and attendants filled ceremonial space around the royal body. The city's palaces were places of administration as much as luxury, and the boundary between sacred performance and political management was thin. When Nefertiti appeared with Akhenaten beneath the Aten, that image stood on the labour of a whole city. A lesser-known detail of Amarna is how vividly it preserves the difference between elite ideology and ordinary urban strain. The decorated tombs and royal images show the shining surface of the regime, but the city's cemeteries and settlement remains remind archaeologists that many people live difficult lives beneath that brilliance. Studies of non-royal burials at Amarna have pointed to evidence of physical stress among parts of the population. Though interpretations must be careful and the sample does not speak for every person in the city, the capital of sunlight was still a place of hard work, disease, heat, dust, food distribution, and social hierarchy. No single explanation fully accounts for what daily life felt like across all levels of Amarna society. The official art shows divine abundance. The human remains and settlement archaeology suggest a more complicated reality. For the royal family, the palace world was highly controlled. Access to the king and queen mattered enormously. Reward scenes in elite tombs show officials receiving gold collars and honours from the royal balcony, a ceremonial moment that made royal favour visible. These scenes are not casual records of generosity, they dramatise dependency. The official flourishes because the king recognises him. The official's tomb then preserves that recognition as part of his hoped-for afterlife. Nefertiti sometimes appears in such contexts as part of the royal presence, reinforcing the idea that favour flows through the household of the Aten. To be near that household was to be near the centre of the world Amarna was trying to build. The princesses also became part of that visual politics. Aten, the eldest daughter, appears prominently and later seems to have taken on roles of importance, especially in the tangled final years of the Amarna period. Akhenaten would eventually become Akhenaten, connected to Tutankhamun and the restoration after Akhenaten. These later transformations show how the daughters were not only symbols within Amarna art, they were also dynastic figures whose lives became entangled with Egypt's attempt to survive the collapse of the Aten experiment. Scholars still debate the details, because names change, inscriptions are damaged, and royal identities in the transition period can blur. But the daughter's visibility means that Nefertiti's motherhood was not a private footnote. It was part of the political structure of the reign. There is a deep irony here. Amarna makes the royal family more visible than many earlier courts, yet that visibility does not protect their endings from confusion. The family is everywhere in image, but not securely in death. Some royal bodies may have been buried first at Amarna and later moved. Some funerary objects may have been reassigned. Some names may have been altered or erased after the restoration. The more the royal household was used to embody the Aten's truth, the more vulnerable it became when that truth was rejected. Once Egypt turned away from Akhenaten's vision, the sacred family of Amarna could be treated not as the heart of order, but as a memory to be managed, corrected, and partially buried. Nefertiti stands at the centre of this family display. She is queen, ritual partner, mother, and visual counterpart to the king. Her daughters help define her role, but they do not reduce her to it. Instead, they intensify her position within the sacred household. Through them, she becomes the source of continuity under the Aten, the feminine axis of a dynasty that presents itself as uniquely blessed. And that is why her later vanishing is not only the disappearance of an individual, it is the disappearance of the mother queen of an entire religious image world. When Nefertiti fades from certainty, the family under the Aten begins to lose its centre. The rays still shine in the surviving reliefs, the small hands still hold out signs of life, but the people beneath them are already moving toward one of the most confused and fragile transitions in Egyptian royal history. The brightness of Amarna has always made its shadows harder to see. The city's official art insists on abundance offering tables stacked high with bread, flowers, cattle, fowl, fruit, and jars, rays of the Aten reaching down with tiny hands of life, royal bodies gleaming in ritual nearness to the sun. But no city, however sacred its founding, can live by image alone. Behind the radiant theology stood a kingdom that still needed grain to move, borders to be watched, vassals to be managed, temples to be staffed or stripped, and ordinary loyalties to be redirected away from gods whose names had filled Egypt for centuries. Akhenaten may have been designed as a new beginning, but it existed inside an old world that did not simply vanish because the king commanded it to. The cracks in the golden vision appear first not as one dramatic disaster, but as pressures gathering at the edges, political, religious, economic, and perhaps biological, each difficult to measure with certainty. Each capable of weakening a system already built around a narrow royal centre. The religious pressure was the most visible. Akhenaten's devotion to the Aten did not merely add a new cult to Egypt's crowded sacred landscape. Over time, it increasingly displaced older gods, especially Amun, whose name and images were attacked in some contexts. This was not a small theological adjustment. Amun's temples were among the most powerful institutions in the country, and their reach extended far beyond ritual into landholding, labor, storage, administration, and elite identity. To diminish such a cult was to disturb a vast network of people and property: priests, scribes, craftsmen, farmers attached to temple estates, and families whose status depended on older religious service all had reasons to feel the change. The evidence does not let us hear their private complaints, and scholars still debate the full intensity of opposition during Akhenaten's lifetime. But it is hard to imagine that the shift produced no resistance. Egypt had room for many gods. Akhenaten's narrowing vision made less room, and that narrowing must have carried consequences. There is also a quieter kind of resistance, the kind that leaves faint traces because ordinary people do not always obey ideology in ways kings can easily carve. Official Amarna religion places the Aten and royal family at the center, but private belief in Egypt was deeply rooted in household practices, protective deities, ancestor memory, amulets, birth rituals, healing hopes, and local traditions. People might publicly participate in the new order while privately clinging to older habits. Archaeology at Amarna has suggested that domestic religion did not simply disappear. Even if the official language of the city tried to reshape devotion, small objects, household arrangements, and personal practices can reveal a more complicated religious life beneath royal proclamation. What survives in the record suggests that Akhenaten could transform temples and inscriptions more easily than he could transform every fear, hope, and habit inside Egyptian homes. Economic strain may have followed the religious strain. Building a new capital required resources on an enormous scale: stone, mud brick, timber, food, labor, transport, decoration, administrative supplies, and skilled craftsmanship all had to be gathered quickly. Akhenaten's speed was part of its wonder, but speed is expensive. It demands coordination and pressure. Workers had to quarry, carry, plaster, paint, carve, bake, brew, sweep, and repair under the desert heat. Officials had to feed the machinery of a royal city that existed because one king insisted it must exist. No single explanation fully accounts for Amarna's social reality, but the contrast between elite imagery and evidence of strain among some non-elite remains is difficult to ignore. The sacred horizon was a place of splendor for the court, yet for many people it was likely a place of obligation, hard labor, and uncertain reward. Beyond Egypt, the late Bronze Age diplomatic world was becoming increasingly tense. The Amarna letters, those clay tablets written mostly in Akkadian, preserve a court connected to foreign kings and vassal rulers across Western Asia. They are among the most revealing documents of the age, not because they explain everything, but because they let anxiety leak through the formal language of diplomacy. Local rulers ask for help, complain about enemies, accuse rivals, request gold, and warn that territories may be lost. Some of these complaints may be exaggerated because vassal rulers had every reason to dramatize their need in letters to Egypt. Still, the general picture is not one of serene imperial control. The Levant is unstable. Rival powers watch Egypt. The Hittites are rising in Anatolia and Syria. Mitanni's fortunes are changing. Smaller city-states maneuver for survival. Egypt's empire may still be formidable, but its edges require attention. Akhenaten has often been portrayed as a king too absorbed in religion to manage foreign affairs, but that may be too simple. The evidence remains incomplete, and diplomatic correspondence is a difficult mirror. Some problems visible in the letters may have begun before him, or may have been magnified by local politics. Egyptian power in Western Asia did not collapse overnight under Akhenaten. Yet there is a real sense that the court's focus had shifted inward toward religious reform and the new capital. Even if Akhenaten was not as negligent as older caricatures suggest, the pressures abroad were real enough. The empire needed careful management at the same moment the king was reorganizing Egypt's sacred center. A regime can survive one large strain. Several at once are more dangerous. Then there is the possibility of disease. The late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean and Near Eastern world may have experienced episodes of plague or epidemic illness, and some scholars have connected hints from the period to the wider atmosphere of disruption. At Amarna itself, the evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. Several royal deaths appear to cluster in the later years of Akhenaten's reign, including members of the royal family, and plague has sometimes been proposed as one possible explanation, but it must remain a possibility, not a certainty. Ancient records rarely describe disease in the clinical terms modern readers want, and death in a royal household could result from many causes. The evidence remains incomplete. Still, the idea of illness spreading through a crowded capital, through diplomatic routes, military movement, or ordinary human contact, is not implausible in a connected Bronze Age world. If disease did touch Amarna, it would have struck at the symbolic center of the entire system. The Aten's theology presented the royal family as uniquely blessed by life-giving light. The repeated deaths or disappearances of royal figures would not simply be private tragedies. They would threaten the image of overflowing vitality that the regime had carved into stone. A sacred family can carry enormous ideological power, but it also creates risk. When the family appears healthy, fertile, and radiant, it confirms the order. When succession becomes uncertain, when names vanish, when daughters change roles, when a queen's presence becomes harder to trace, the image begins to tremble. The very intimacy that made Amarna art compelling made political instability feel personal. Nefertiti's position within these pressures is difficult to define, but impossible to ignore. If she held the kind of expanded ritual authority her images suggest, then she was not merely watching the strain gather around Akhenaten's project. She was part of the system that had to absorb it. She stood beside the king as temples changed, old gods were suppressed, new ceremonies filled the open courts, foreign letters arrived, and the royal household carried the burden of appearing divinely secure. Her prominence made her powerful, but it also made her vulnerable to the fate of the entire experiment. If Amarna prospered, she shone. If Amarna faltered, her image would be tied to the fault line. The golden vision did not break all at once. The sun still rose over Akhenaten. Offerings were still made. Artists still shaped royal faces. Scribes still wrote. Processions still moved along the road. But beneath the images of perfect light, Egypt's old gravity was pulling. The temples of Amun had not forgotten themselves. The people's habits had not been remade completely. The empire's edges were not silent. The city's labour was not weightless. And in the royal family, where the Aten's life was supposed to appear most clearly, the record begins to approach the foggiest part of the story. Nefertiti is still bright, but the conditions that made her brightness possible are becoming unstable. The queen, who seemed fixed at the centre of Amarna's sunlit order, is moving toward the years when even her name will become difficult to follow. The fading of Nefertiti does not happen like a curtain falling. It happens the way ancient evidence often breaks apart. One title survives here. One image is damaged there. One name appears with altered emphasis. And then a figure who once stood in the full heat of the royal display begins to move beyond certainty. For much of Akhenaten's reign, Nefertiti is unmistakable. She is beside him in ritual, beneath the Aten's rays, inside the visual machinery of the new capital. Then, somewhere in the later Amarna years, the trail becomes harder. The queen who had been made almost unavoidable in stone and paint becomes a problem of dates, names, substitutions, erasures, and scholarly caution. Her vanishing is not the absence of all evidence. It is the presence of evidence that no longer behaves cleanly. For many years, a common view held that Nefertiti disappeared from the record around year 12 of Akhenaten's reign. That date mattered because it seemed to mark the last secure appearance of the queen before silence. The great Durbar scene of year 12, showing foreign tribute and royal ceremony, still places the Amarna family in a display of power and international reach. After that, some members of the royal household become more difficult to follow. Older interpretations imagine that Nefertiti may have died around this time, perhaps during a period of illness or dynastic trouble. It was a simple explanation, and simple explanations have a certain appeal when the evidence is fragmentary. But the Amarna record has a way of punishing neatness. Later finds and rereadings have complicated the idea that Nefertiti simply died and vanished in year 12. One important clue comes from inscriptions that may place her later in the reign, possibly around year 16. A graffito from a limestone quarry at Deir Abu Hinis has been read by many scholars as referring to Nefertiti as Great Royal Wife in year 16 of Akhenaten. If this reading is correct, it pushes her visible presence close to the end of Akhenaten's reign and weakens the older idea that she disappeared several years earlier. The evidence must still be handled carefully. A single inscription can carry enormous weight. An interpretation depends on reading damaged ancient signs with precision. Yet this clue matters because it keeps Nefertiti alive in the record longer than earlier narratives allowed. The queen may not fade because she died early. She may fade because her role changed. That possibility opens the most fascinating part of the mystery. In the final years of Amarna, names begin to shift around the royal court in ways that remain difficult to untangle. Figures such as Meritaten, Smenkhkar, and Nefertiti appear in the tangled succession after Akhenaten, and scholars still debate their identities, relationships, and order. Some names may refer to different people, some may represent changed titles, some may have been reused or altered. Egyptian royal names are not casual labels, they are political instruments, theological declarations, and claims to legitimacy. When the same elements appear in different combinations, and when inscriptions are damaged or later modified, certainty becomes fragile. Nefertiti's expanded name, Nefertiti, makes the problem sharper, because Nefertiti later appears as a royal name in its own right. This is where the queen begins to fade not into nothing, but into ambiguity. If Nefertiti remained great royal wife until late in Akhenaten's reign, what happened next? Did she die shortly before him? Did she become co-regent? Did she take on a more formal kingly identity under the name Nefertiti? Did another royal woman, perhaps Meritaten, occupy that role instead? No single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence, and each theory must explain not only names, but objects, inscriptions, funerary goods, and later attempts to restore order after Amarna. The mystery is not a blank wall. It is a wall covered with faint outlines, overwritten signs, and plaster repairs. The emotional force of this fading comes from the contrast with her earlier visibility. Nefertiti had been shown as if the world needed to see her. Her crowns were distinctive, her presence repeated, her authority visually enlarged. If she had died in an ordinary way, one might expect some clearer trace of burial or transition, especially in a city where royal death was planned into the landscape. Akhenaten's boundary text suggested that royal burials at Amarna mattered to the project. The royal tomb in the eastern cliffs was not an afterthought. It was part of the sacred geography of the new capital. There were spaces intended for royal death, for the king and for members of the royal family. Yet Nefertiti's confirmed burial is not there. Her tomb is not securely identified. Her mummy is not securely known. The woman who helped animate Akhenaten's rituals leaves no final resting place that can be named without hesitation. The problem is made worse by the later abandonment of Amarna. A royal burial in a stable city can be damaged, robbed, or forgotten, but it remains within a landscape that continues to be remembered. Amarna did not enjoy that continuity. After Akhenaten, the capital was deserted, its temples dismantled, its ideology rejected, and its royal dead may have become politically inconvenient. If Nefertiti was buried there, her body and funerary equipment could have been moved, disturbed, reused, or lost during the restoration. If she was never buried there, then the question becomes even stranger. Was she taken to Thebes? Was she buried in the Valley of the Kings under another name? Was her burial equipment absorbed into the funerary arrangements of later rulers? The evidence remains incomplete, and each path leads into uncertainty. The fading also involves deliberate memory. Akhenaten's reign did not become simply another past reign honoured in king lists. Later rulers had reasons to treat the Amarna episode as a disruption. The names of Akhenaten and some of his successors were omitted from official lists. Monuments were dismantled, blocks were reused, traditional cults were restored. Tutankhamun himself, born into the Atenist royal world, later changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun. A small linguistic act with enormous ideological weight. Within that restoration, Nefertiti's memory could not remain untouched. She'd been too central to the rejected experiment, even if later Egyptians did not target her with the same intensity as Akhenaten. Her association with Amarna made her vulnerable to the broader erasure. And yet erasure is never complete. That is the paradox that keeps the mystery alive. Nefertiti fades from the official sequence, but not from archaeological recovery. Her bust survives, her reliefs survive, her names survive in fragments. The Amarna city plan survives enough to let us walk its ghost streets. The problem is not that she vanished entirely, but that she vanished at the precise point where history most wants a clean answer. Her life is visible, her role is visible, her beauty is visible, her power is visible, her ending is not. By the time the record reaches the last years of Akhenaten, Nefertiti has become less like a person standing in front of us, and more like a figure seen through heat shimmer. She may still be there, but the outline bends. The queen who once anchored the solar household begins to merge with the succession crisis that follows. Names thicken around her. Titles change their force. Later corrections disturb earlier meanings. The city that made her radiant is itself moving toward abandonment. Her disappearance begins not in a tomb, but in the paperwork of power, in the instability of royal names, in the collapse of a sacred experiment that had tied her identity too closely to the sun. The queen begins to fade because Amarna itself is fading. And when a city built to rewrite eternity starts to fail, Even its most luminous face can slip into uncertainty. Once Nefertiti begins to fade from certainty, the temptation is to force the evidence into a single clean ending. A queen lives, a queen dies, a queen is buried, a queen is forgotten. That is how a stable story wants to move. But Amarna does not give us that luxury. The final years of Akhenaten's reign, and the years immediately after him, are among the most difficult stretches of New Kingdom royal history. Not because nothing survives, but because what survives is tangled. Names appear without enough context. Funerary objects seem to have been adapted. Royal identities overlap in ways that still provoke debate. Later restoration efforts blur the sequence further. Nefertiti's disappearance sits inside this confusion, and the major explanations for it are less like rival stories than rival attempts to make sense of broken evidence. The simplest explanation is death. Nefertiti may have died before Akhenaten, perhaps in the later years of the reign, after her long prominence as great royal wife. This would explain why her role appears to change and why other figures, especially Meritaten, become more visible in the final Amarna sequence. Death is not an exotic theory. Royal women died, sometimes suddenly, sometimes in ways the official record did not preserve clearly. If illness touched the royal household, as some scholars have suggested cautiously, Nefertiti could have been among those lost. The death of Akhenaten, one of the royal daughters, is shown in the royal tomb at Amarna in a scene that has long been interpreted as mourning, and while that scene does not prove a plague or explain Nefertiti's fate, it reminds us that the royal family's sacred image did not protect it from mortality. The evidence remains incomplete, but a late death remains possible. The problem is that death alone does not explain the absence of a secure tomb or body. If Nefertiti died as great royal wife during the Amarna period, one might expect her to have been buried in the royal necropolis planned for Akhenaten. The royal tomb, cut into the cliffs of the eastern desert, was associated with Akhenaten and members of his family, and some texts suggest that royal burial at Amarna was part of the king's plan for his new sacred city. A separate or subsidiary space may have been intended for another important royal person, possibly Nefertiti, though certainty is impossible. If she was buried there, the later abandonment of Amarna could have disrupted everything. Her mummy might have been moved. Her funerary equipment might have been stripped, reused, or destroyed. Her burial chamber might have been left unfinished or robbed in antiquity. Death, then, does not close the mystery. It only moves it into the chaos of what happened to Amarna's royal dead after the city failed. Another explanation is promotion. Nefertiti may not have disappeared because she died, but because she rose into a different role. The possibility that she became co-regent with Akhenaten, or even ruled after him under a throne name, has fascinated scholars for decades. It is not a fringe idea in the sensational sense. It grows from real problems in the evidence, especially the appearance of the royal name Ankeperura Neferneferueten and the complicated identities surrounding Shmenkare and the late Amarna succession. Some inscriptions and objects suggest a female ruler using names connected to Neferneferueten. Epithets attached to this figure sometimes include feminine forms or phrases that imply a relationship to Akhenaten. This has led many scholars to argue that a woman ruled briefly after Akhenaten, though they do not all agree on whether that woman was Nefertiti, Meritaten, or someone else. If Nefertiti became Neferneferuaten, her disappearance would be a transformation rather than an ending. The queen would fade from view under her familiar name because she had taken on a more kingly identity. This would fit the arc of her unusual prominence, the queen who offered to the Aten, smote enemies in king-like imagery, and stood as Akhenaten's sacred partner might eventually have crossed the boundary into formal rulership. It would also help explain why her later record becomes entangled with royal names instead of simply stopping. But the theory has its difficulties. Egyptian royal titulary is complex, and damaged evidence can be read in more than one way. Smenkhkare, a short-lived royal figure associated with the end of Amarna, complicates the sequence. Some scholars see Smenkhkare as a separate male ruler, perhaps Akhenaten's co-regent or successor. Others debate the relationship between Smenkhkare and Nefertiti. No single explanation fully accounts for every inscription, object, and chronological clue. The idea of reinvention carries another layer. Nefertiti's public identity was already flexible within Amarna ideology. She was great royal wife, ritual partner, mother of royal daughters, and a figure who sometimes occupied visual territory close to kingship. A change of name or titulary would not be a casual disguise. It would be a theological and political act. If she became a ruling figure during the crisis after Akhenaten, she may have needed to preserve continuity while preparing for restoration, compromise, or transition. The Amarna regime could not simply continue unchanged if resistance and instability were mounting. A royal woman with Nefertiti's stature might have been one of the few people able to bridge Akhenaten's legacy and the survival of the dynasty. What survives in the record suggests a court searching for stability, though the inner strategy remains hidden. A third possibility is political rewriting after Akhenaten. Nefertiti's disappearance may have been shaped not by what happened to her body alone, but by what later Egypt chose to do with her memory. If she died, ruled, or was buried under one set of meanings, the restoration of traditional religion could have recast those meanings. The old gods returned. Amun's name regained honor. Akhenaten was abandoned. The young Tutankhamun became Tutankhamun. The official past was edited so that the Amarna kings became an interruption rather than a legitimate chain of divine rule. In such a process, Nefertiti could be blurred deliberately or indirectly. Her monuments could be dismantled because they belonged to Aten temples. Her names could become inconvenient. Her funerary goods, if valuable and available, could be reassigned. Her burial, if known, could be relocated without leaving the clear record modern historians crave. This rewriting is especially important because ancient Egypt did not treat memory as passive. To preserve a name was to sustain a person's presence in the world of the living and the dead. To erase a name was not simply to remove information, it was an attack on continuity. But erasure could also be practical and administrative. Stone was reused, gold was recut, coffins were adapted, inscriptions were altered. A later regime did not need a modern conspiracy to make Nefertiti vanish. It needed builders, scribes, priests, and officials aligning the material world with a restored order. Over time, that could be enough. The result is that Nefertiti's vanishing may have no single dramatic cause. She may have died late in Akhenaten's reign, and then been displaced by the abandonment of Amarna. She may have been promoted into a ruling identity that later generations suppressed or misunderstood. She may have been caught in a succession crisis where names were adjusted faster than monuments could explain them. She may have been remembered in one context and erased in another. The evidence does not allow a final verdict, but it does allow a more subtle understanding. Nefertiti did not vanish into emptiness. She vanished into transition, into the dangerous space between a failed revolution and a restored kingdom. Her ending may be missing because Egypt itself was changing the terms by which her life could be recorded. The name Nefertiti lies across the last years of Amarna like a shadow cast by more than one body. It is familiar because Nefertiti herself used it as part of her expanded name, Neferuaten Nefertiti, binding her identity to the beauty and perfection of the Aten. But in the confused aftermath of Akhenaten's reign, Neferuaten also appears as a royal name, attached to the throne name Ankheperur. This is where the mystery tightens. The queen who once stood beside Akhenaten may not have disappeared at all in the ordinary sense. She may have stepped into a different royal form, one that later history partly dismantled, misread, or deliberately obscured. If that is true, then Nefertiti's vanishing is not only the story of a missing tomb, it is the story of a woman whose final identity may have been hidden inside the machinery of kingship itself. Egyptian royal names are difficult for modern readers because they do not function like ordinary names. A pharaoh had a full titulary, a sequence of names carrying theological and political meaning. Throne names could be shared, echoed, modified, or adapted. Epithets could signal relationships, divine favour, legitimacy, or a claim to continuity. In the Amarna period, where religious language was already being remade, names become even more loaded. Akhenaten had changed his own name from Amenhotep to mark his devotion to the Aten. Tutankhamun began life as Tutankhaten before his name was changed during the restoration of Amun. In this world, a change of name is not a disguise in the modern sense. It is a public statement about where power comes from and which god, king, or memory grants authority. The figure called Ankheperur Neferuaten appears in inscriptions and on objects from the transition after Akhenaten. The identity of this ruler has long been debated. Some evidence suggests that Neferuaten was female, because certain epithets and grammatical forms appear to point in that direction. One of the most important phrases associated with this figure can be understood as beloved of Akhenaten, or effective for her husband, depending on the reading and context. Such details matter enormously because they suggest not merely a royal successor, but possibly a female successor closely connected to Akhenaten. Nefertiti is the obvious candidate because she'd already borne the name Neferuaten and had already occupied a position of extraordinary prominence. Yet obvious does not mean proven. Scholars still debate whether this ruler was Nefertiti, Meritaten, or another royal woman whose traces have been folded into the same problem. The case for Nefertiti rests partly on momentum. Over the course of Akhenaten's reign, she does not appear as a conventional queen who suddenly becomes important at the end. She is important from the beginning, and grows more charged as the Amarna vision matures. She offers to the Aten. She appears in large scale. She sometimes takes on king-like gestures. Her imagery presses toward rulership without fully crossing the line in a way that surviving evidence makes undeniable. If Akhenaten's regime needed continuity near the end of his life, Nefertiti was one of the few figures with enough sacred visibility to provide it. She had been made into the queen of the Aten's world. To elevate her into a co-regent or successor would not have come from nowhere. It would have been the final extension of a role the court had already been preparing the eye to accept. One clue often discussed in this debate is the so-called co-regency stela, a damaged monument later altered in ways that make it difficult to interpret. It seems to have shown Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and one of their daughters, but later changes may have transformed the identities represented. Some scholars have seen in it evidence that Nefertiti's role evolved into that of a co-ruler. Others are more cautious, arguing that the damage and alteration make firm conclusions dangerous. This is typical of the Amarna problem. The most exciting evidence often arrives already wounded. It invites interpretation but resists final obedience. The stone does not speak clearly enough to settle the matter, but it keeps the possibility alive that Nefertiti's status shifted before the end. The rival presence in this puzzle is Smenkhkare. Smenkhkare is a short-lived royal figure near the end of the Amarna period, possibly a male successor or co-regent, perhaps connected by marriage to Aten. His reign, if it can be called that, is brief and poorly documented. The relationship between Smenkhkare and Nefertiti has produced a long debate. Were they separate rulers? Was one name earlier and another later? Did later scribes, usurpers, or restorers confuse the sequence? Did objects pass from one burial assemblage to another, carrying names that no longer match their final owner? The evidence remains incomplete, and no single arrangement solves every difficulty. But the presence of Smenkhkare means that Nefertiti's possible transformation cannot be isolated from the larger succession crisis. She's not the only shadow in the room. If Nefertiti did rule as Nefertiti, her reign was probably brief. It would have unfolded in one of the most delicate moments Egypt had faced in generations. Akhenaten's religious project could not simply continue unchanged, yet a sudden rejection of it might threaten the legitimacy of the royal house itself. A transitional ruler would have needed to balance memory and survival. The old gods were waiting in the wings, especially Amun. But the royal family still carried the blood and symbols of Amarna. In such a moment, Nefertiti may have been uniquely useful. As Akhenaten's chief queen and sacred partner, she could claim continuity with the dead king. As a ruling figure, she might also begin the slow movement away from the most extreme forms of Atenism. This remains inference, not certainty. But it helps explain why a powerful royal woman might emerge briefly at precisely the moment when the court needed both legitimacy and flexibility. The funerary evidence complicates the picture further. Some objects found in Tutankhamun's tomb appear to have been made for or associated with other royal figures before being adapted for the young king's burial. This is not unusual in periods of crisis. Royal funerary equipment was expensive, symbolically dense, and sometimes repurposed when death arrived suddenly or politics changed quickly. The name Nefertiti appears in connection with items that later ended up in Tutankhamun's burial world, suggesting that the material afterlife of the Amarna rulers was tangled. If Nefertiti became Nefertiti and had funerary goods prepared for her, some of those objects may have been redirected. But again, the record refuses to give a clean confession. Reuse tells us there was disruption. It does not always tell us whose body was supposed to lie beneath the gold. There is something almost fitting about Nefertiti becoming most mysterious at the moment she may have become most powerful. As queen, she is visible, named, crowned, and pictured. As possible ruler, she becomes harder to distinguish. The formal language of kingship that might have elevated her also absorbs her. A woman who had been known to modern history by one of the most recognizable faces in the world may have entered a system of throne names and epithets where her familiar identity dissolved. If she ruled as Nefertiti, later restoration could have made that identity inconvenient. A female ruler tied to Akhenaten's failed religious experiment would not fit easily into the cleaned-up memory Egypt later preferred. Her reign could be shortened, obscured, or folded into the troubled interval between Akhenaten and Tutankhamun. Yet the theory must remain a theory. The strongest version of the Nefertiti as Nefertiti argument is compelling, but it is not a settled fact. Aten remains an alternative candidate for some scholars. Smenkkare's place remains uncertain. The readings of key inscriptions are technical and sometimes disputed. The later reuse of objects muddies the sequence. The shadow of Nefertiti is therefore not a solved identity but a historical pressure point. It shows that Nefertiti's disappearance cannot be reduced to a missing burial. Her final years may have involved a change of political form so profound that the old name no longer appears where modern readers expect it. If Nefertiti ruled under another name, then her vanishing becomes more dramatic in a quieter way. She did not simply step out of history, she may have stepped deeper into it, into the dangerous centre of succession, legitimacy, and religious reversal. She may have tried to hold together a world already cracking beneath the weight of Akhenaten's vision. She may have worn a throne name that preserved the Aten's beauty while the old gods waited to return, and when the restoration came, when Tutankhamun's court turned back toward Ammon and Thebes, that brief shadow rule may have become one more part of Amarna that had to be softened, overwritten, or left unnamed. The queen's face survived. Her possible crown as ruler did not survive so clearly. In the space between those two facts, Nefertiti remains one of the most haunting names in Egypt's unfinished history. The return from Amarna does not look like a single door closing. It looks more like a careful turning of Egypt's face back toward older light. The Aten does not vanish in one instant, and the gods whom Akhenaten diminished do not simply reappear as though nothing has happened. Institutions must be restored, names must be changed, temples must be repaired, priests must be reinstalled, and the official story of kingship must be made believable again. The court that survives Akhenaten inherits a dangerous problem. It cannot pretend the Amarna years never occurred, because the royal family, palaces, objects, officials, and monuments are still there. But it also cannot allow Akhenaten's vision to remain the centre of Egyptian legitimacy. Somewhere between memory and denial, the restoration begins. Tutankhamun stands at the heart of that return, though he begins not as Tutankhamun but as Tutankhaten, a name still tied to the god of Akhenaten. His early life belongs to the Amarna world, to the same royal environment that had made Nefertiti so visible. His later name, Tutankhamun, marks one of the most famous religious reversals in Egyptian history. The living image of the Aten becomes the living image of Ammon. That change is not a small personal adjustment. It is a royal announcement that the restored order has chosen its god, its city, and its future. The name itself becomes a bridge away from Akhenaten's horizon and back toward Thebes, Karnak, and the deep institutional memory of Amun. What survives in the record suggests a court trying to repair sacred continuity after a disruption that had unsettled Egypt's foundations. The restoration is expressed most clearly in the Restoration Stela, a text associated with Tutankhamun's reign that describes temples fallen into neglect, gods ignored, and Egypt suffering because proper worship had been disturbed. Like all royal inscriptions, it is not a neutral report. It is political theology, designed to justify the new direction of the court. It portrays the return to the old gods as the healing of a wounded land. The text does not need to name Akhenaten directly to make its target clear. The world has gone wrong because the gods have not been served properly. The king now makes it right by rebuilding temples, restoring offerings, and re-establishing ritual order. Scholars still debate how much of this reflects literal neglect and how much reflects the rhetoric of a new regime defining itself against the old one. Either way, the message is unmistakable. Amarna is being recast as a mistake. For Nefertiti's memory, this is a dangerous moment. She had not been a minor ornament of Akhenaten's experiment. She'd been one of its great public faces. Her images stood under the Aten's rays. Her name was bound to the Aten's beauty. Her authority had been enlarged inside the very system now being corrected. If the restoration wanted to move Egypt away from Akhenaten, it also had to deal with the visual and material world that had made Nefertiti radiant. Her monuments, like his, belonged to a rejected religious language. Her prominence could not be preserved unchanged without preserving part of the revolution itself. The evidence remains incomplete, but the broader pattern is clear enough. The Amarna legacy was not lovingly curated by its successors. It was dismantled, reused, and pushed into the margins of official memory. Akhenaten itself was gradually abandoned. The city that had been proclaimed as the Aten's sacred horizon lost its reason for existing once the court turned back toward traditional centers. Officials, craftsmen, administrators, and religious personnel moved away or lost the roles that had tied them to the capital. Houses fell into ruin, temples were stripped, palaces emptied. The desert, always patient, began taking back the experiment. This abandonment is crucial to Nefertiti's disappearance, because a living city protects memory differently from a dead one. In Thebes or Memphis, temples could be repaired, tombs visited, cults maintained, names repeated. At Amarna, memory became fragile because the entire place became politically inconvenient. A queen whose final arrangements were tied to that landscape could easily become difficult to trace once the landscape itself was rejected. The dismantling was also physical. The small talatat blocks used in Aten temples made Akhenaten's building program fast, but they also made its destruction efficient. Later builders could take those blocks and pack them inside new pylons, foundations, and walls, hiding Amarna scenes inside monuments of a restored order. This is one of the great ironies of the period. The effort to erase Akhenaten and his world preserved fragments of them. Blocks that might have been destroyed completely survived because they were useful as construction material. Nefertiti's image, carved for the sunlit theology of the Aten, could end up buried inside architecture dedicated to a different religious future. Her memory was not always smashed into dust. Sometimes it was sealed into the body of Egypt's return. The restoration also reshaped royal legitimacy. After Tutankhamun, the throne passes through figures such as A and then Horemheb, and the official memory of the dynasty becomes increasingly selective. Horemheb, in particular, presents himself as a restorer of order after chaos, and later king lists omit the Amarna rulers, moving the official sequence as if the troubling years had been absorbed or bypassed. Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Neferuaten, Tutankhamun, and I could all be treated in different ways by later memory, but the general direction is toward correction and compression. The past is cleaned. The line of legitimate kingship is made to look smoother than it was. Nefertiti, if she had ruled as Neferuaten or remained central to the late Amarna court, would have been especially vulnerable to being blurred by that cleanup. Yet the restoration was not simple vengeance. Egypt did not merely rage against Amarna, it also used what Amarna left behind: royal workshops, trained officials, gold, coffins, shrines, furniture, and ceremonial objects did not lose all value because their original theology became awkward. In a period of rapid transition, material reuse was practical. Objects could be reinscribed, names could be replaced. A piece made for one royal person could be adapted for another. This does not prove any single theory about Nefertiti's burial, but it creates the world in which such confusion becomes possible. If her funerary equipment existed, it may not have remained safely attached to her name. If her body was moved, the record of that movement may not have survived. If her royal identity changed, later alterations may have made the trail still harder to follow. Tutankhamun's own reign becomes a paradox in this larger story. His tomb would one day become the most famous royal tomb ever found in Egypt. Yet his historical role in life was tied to repairing the world that produced Nefertiti's mystery. under his name, or under the officials who governed around him, the court turned away from the Aten, restored Amun, and began the process that made Amarna into a rejected episode. His burial later preserved a dazzling collection of objects, some of which seem to carry traces of reuse from the troubled transition. This makes him both heir and cover-heir to the Amarna royal line, cover over the evidence of what came just before. The boy king's golden afterlife would eventually dominate the public imagination so completely that Nefertiti's missing ending became entangled with his tomb, his objects, and his walls. By the time the restoration takes hold, Nefertiti's world has changed beyond recognition. The city where she shone is emptying. The god whose rays framed her power is being displaced. The family imagery that made her central to sacred life no longer serves the official future. Her name, her possible later identity, her burial, and her material afterlife all enter the fog created by political repair. Egypt returns to its older gods, but it does not return the record to clarity. Instead, the restoration creates the conditions for a queen without a tomb, a woman too important to vanish entirely, too tied to Amarna to be remembered cleanly, and too close to the succession crisis to leave an easy trail. The old order comes back, but in coming back, it helps bury the ending of the queen who once stood in the sun. A royal tomb in ancient Egypt was never just a hole in the ground. It was a machine for eternity, a protected passage between the living world and the transformed existence of the dead. Its architecture, decoration, texts, equipment, ceiling, and location all work together to preserve not only a body, but a royal identity, for a king, and sometimes for those closest to the king. Burial was an act of theology and politics as much as mourning. The tomb declared that the person inside had entered the divine order. It protected the name, it guarded the body, it gave the dead a place from which to continue. This is why Nefertiti's missing tomb feels so wrong. Egypt knew how to prepare royal endings. It built landscapes of death with obsessive care. Yet one of the most visible women of the Amarna age leaves no confirmed chamber, no securely named mummy, no final architecture that Egyptology can point to and say, without hesitation, here she was placed. The first place the search has to face is Amarna itself. Akhenaten did not build Akhenaten as a temporary court camp. The city had a royal necropolis, cut into the eastern cliffs, beyond the plain where the temples and palaces stood. The royal tomb, often identified as Tomb 26, lies in a remote wadi, away from the main settlement, approached through desert paths that already feel like a movement out of the living city and into a harsher sacred silence. The tomb was associated with Akhenaten and members of his family, and its decoration included scenes connected to royal death, especially the death of the princess Akhenaten. Some parts were finished, others incomplete, and the plan suggests expansion, adaptation, and possibly intended spaces for more than one royal burial. What survives in the record suggests that Akhenaten imagined royal death as part of the Amarna project, not as an afterthought. This creates the first major possibility. Nefertiti may originally have been intended for burial at Amarna. She had been central to the Atenist court, central to the royal family's sacred imagery, and central to the city's public theology. It would not be surprising if the planned burial landscape of Akhenaten included her. Some interpretations of the royal tomb and related texts allow for the possibility that Nefertiti, or another high royal figure, had a place in the funerary arrangements. There is also an unfinished annex whose purpose remains debated. It may have been intended for a royal woman, perhaps Nefertiti, though this cannot be proven. The evidence remains incomplete, but the idea is historically reasonable The queen of the Aten's horizon might have been meant to rest in the cliffs of that same horizon. But Amarna did not last. That is the difficulty. A tomb made for eternity becomes vulnerable when the eternity it serves is politically rejected. Once the court abandoned the city and returned toward traditional religious centres, Amarna's royal burials became a problem. A king buried under the theology of the Aten, in a city now treated as a mistake, might not remain peacefully in place. Royal bodies could be moved, funerary equipment could be stripped or repurposed, tombs could be entered, damaged, or left exposed to robbery. If Nefertiti died and was buried at Amarna, her burial may have been disturbed during or after the restoration. Her body may have been transferred to Thebes. Her equipment may have lost its clear association with her name, or the burial may have been damaged so thoroughly that only scattered traces remain. No single explanation fully accounts for the absence, but Amarna's abandonment makes absence easier to understand. The second great landscape is the Valley of the Kings. By the late 18th dynasty, the valley had become the most important royal burial ground in Egypt, hidden in the Theban cliffs, cut into limestone, watched by desert peaks and guarded by remoteness. It offered a different kind of royal afterlife from Amarna. The valley was tied to older religious traditions, especially the nocturnal journey of the sun god and the king's passage through the underworld. Its tombs were not built for open solar worship in the Amarna style. They were deep, secretive, painted with divine texts and populated by underworld beings. If the restoration meant bringing the royal dead back into acceptable sacred geography, the valley would have been the natural place to consider. This is where Nefertiti's missing tomb becomes entangled with Tutankhamun. His tomb, KV62, was small by royal standards, almost awkwardly compact for a king, and its discovery in 1922 changed the modern imagination of ancient Egypt forever. Because the tomb was unusually preserved and because some of its objects appear to have been adapted from earlier royal funerary equipment, it became a magnet for theories about the Amarna transition. If Tutankhamun was buried quickly, using items made for others, then those others may have included figures from the late Amarna court. If a female ruler named Nefertiti had funerary goods prepared, and if Nefertiti was that ruler, then traces of her afterlife could have ended up inside Tutankhamun's burial assemblage. This does not prove her tomb is nearby. It only shows how the material world of one burial can carry the ghost of another. The most famous version of this idea proposes that Tutankhamun's burial chamber may have been part of a larger tomb originally made for Nefertiti, or that hidden chambers behind its walls might belong to her burial. The thought is irresistible. The world's most famous Egyptian tomb as a doorway to the world's most famous missing queen. It has all the force of a perfect archaeological story. But perfect stories are often where caution is most needed. The visible facts are intriguing but not conclusive. KV62 is small, its plan is unusual, and its decoration has prompted debate. Yet unusual does not automatically mean hidden. Reused goods do not automatically mean the original owner lies next door. The evidence must be weighed against surveys, geology, architecture, and the long history of tomb modification in the valley. Other mummies have also entered the discussion. KV21, a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, contained two female mummies often called KV21A and KV21B. Because of their possible late 18th dynasty context and genetic relationships proposed in studies of Tutankhamun's family, they have been discussed in connection with royal women of the Amarna period. KV21. A has sometimes been suggested as Akhenaten, Tutankhamun's wife, because of possible links to the two small mummified fetuses found in his tomb. KV21B has attracted speculation as well. sometimes in relation to Nefertiti, but these identifications remain uncertain. DNA from ancient mummies can be degraded, contaminated, difficult to interpret, and dependent on comparison samples that are themselves debated. The evidence remains incomplete, and no mummy from KV-21 has been accepted as Nefertiti by firm scholarly consensus. This is the heart of the problem. Nefertiti may be missing because her tomb has not yet been found. She may be missing because a tomb was found long ago but not recognized. She may be missing because her body was moved, damaged, separated from its burial goods, or relabeled by history's accidents. She may be missing because she ruled under another name, and the tomb we seek under Nefertiti was prepared for Neferuaten. Or she may be missing because the royal burial arrangements of the Amarna transition were thrown into such disorder that no single clean tomb ever held her memory for long. Egypt built for eternity, but eternity depended on political continuity, and Nefertiti lived at the moment when continuity broke. The tomb refuses discovery because the question itself may be too narrow. Modern imagination wants a sealed chamber with her name still bright on the wall, her body untouched, her story waiting intact. Ancient history rarely gives such gifts. More often, it gives a reused coffin, a scratched-out cartouche, a fragment of gold foil, a displaced mummy, a tomb plan that almost makes sense, and a silence where a name should be. Nefertiti's burial may not be hidden in one place. It may be dispersed across Amarna, the Valley of the Kings, Tutankhamun's objects, uncertain mummies, and erased inscriptions. The queen without a tomb may once have had more than one resting place in intention, in preparation, or in movement. What is missing is the stable final version that survived long enough for archaeology to recognize it. And so the search continues, not because Egypt forgot how to bury queens, but because Nefertiti's world collapsed between burial and memory. The modern hunt for Nefertiti's tomb has often felt like a contest between silence and technology. Ancient Egypt left the mystery in fragments, damaged names, reused objects, uncertain mummies, unfinished spaces, and walls that may or may not conceal older intentions. Modern archaeology brings cameras, radar, genetic testing, digital modelling, conservation science, satellite imagery, and the intense pressure of public imagination. Yet the more precise the instruments become, the more stubborn the mystery sometimes appears. Nefertiti has not been found because people have failed to look. She has not been found even though they have looked with some of the most sophisticated tools available, and even though every possible clue near Tutankhamun's tomb can become global news almost overnight. The strange lesson of the search is that better technology does not always produce simpler answers. Sometimes it produces sharper uncertainty. The most famous modern possibility begins with the walls of KV-62 Tutankhamun's tomb. When the tomb was discovered in 1922, its small size surprised many observers. It did not feel like the grand, sprawling royal tomb one might expect for a pharaoh, even a young one who died unexpectedly. Its plan was compact. Its burial chamber was decorated only in limited areas. Its packed objects seemed magnificent but also rushed, crowded, and in some cases adapted over time. These facts encourage the idea that Tutankhamun's burial might have been improvised inside a tomb not originally intended for him. This alone is not extraordinary. Sudden royal deaths could create hurried arrangements, but when joined to the confusion of the Amarna succession, the idea became much more provocative. If this small tomb had belonged first to someone else, and if that someone else was tied to Nefertiti or Neferuaten, then Cave 62 might not be merely the tomb of Tutankhamun, It might be the visible front of a larger, older story. The theory took its most dramatic modern form when high-resolution digital recording of Tutankhamun's burial chamber suggested to some eyes that the walls might contain traces of sealed doorways. Nicholas Reeves argued that subtle lines visible in detailed scans could indicate blocked passages behind the north and west walls, and that Nefertiti's burial might lie beyond them. The idea was electrifying because it joined two irresistible forces: the most famous intact royal tomb ever found and the most famous missing queen of Egypt. It also carried a kind of historical logic. Tutankhamun's tomb was small. Some objects seemed reused. The Amarna transition was chaotic. Nefertiti, if she became a ruling figure under another name, might have had royal funerary arrangements. A hidden continuation of KV-62 would explain why her tomb had never been located elsewhere. It was an elegant theory. And elegant theories have a way of entering public imagination before the evidence has finished being tested. Radar seemed, for a brief moment, to encourage the hope. Early scanning of the walls produced reports interpreted as possible hidden spaces or organic and metallic materials beyond the burial chamber. The excitement was enormous. For people outside Egyptology, it felt as if the Queen might be only a wall away, waiting behind painted plaster that had watched over Tutankhamun for more than 3,000 years. But archaeology is not allowed to live on excitement alone. Further tests were required. Different teams scanned the tomb. Different instruments, conditions, and interpretations produced disagreement. Some results seemed to support the possibility of voids. Others did not. The tomb became a case study in how difficult geophysical survey can be in a complex ancient environment, where natural geology, wall thickness, moisture, previous repairs, and instrument behavior can complicate the reading. The evidence remained incomplete, and the promise of a hidden chamber began to look less secure. By 2018, a major new survey concluded that there were no hidden chambers or corridors immediately behind the walls of Tutankhamun's burial chamber. This result did not merely dampen enthusiasm, it forced a reconsideration of how far the KV-62 theory could be carried. For many scholars, it made the idea of Nefertiti lying directly behind the north wall highly unlikely. A later academic critique strengthened that caution, arguing that the radar evidence did not support the joint burial hypothesis, and that architecture, survey results, and tomb context weighed against the most dramatic version of the claim. Yet even a strong negative result did not completely end public fascination. Hidden tomb theories rarely die cleanly, especially when the person being sought is Nefertiti. Instead, the debate shifted. Perhaps the chamber was not where first proposed. Perhaps the scans missed something. Perhaps the relevant clue lay not behind a wall, but in the decoration painted on it. That brought attention back to the north wall itself, and to the strange possibility that the wall's painted scene preserves an overwritten memory. Reeves later argued that the cartouches and figures in the burial chamber might show signs of alteration, suggesting that a scene now understood as A. performing rites for the dead. Tutankhamun may once have been composed differently, possibly involving Tutankhamun burying Nefertiti. The claim is subtle and technical. Depending on the reading of painted names, artistic traces, and sequence of modification, it is also controversial. To supporters, the wall becomes not a doorway in the physical sense, but a palimpsest, a surface where one burial story was rewritten into another. To skeptics, the evidence does not carry that much weight, and the interpretation risks making ambiguous details serve a theory already desired. No single explanation fully accounts for every feature of the wall. But the debate shows how Nefertiti's tomb hunt has moved beyond treasure seeking into microscopic attention to paint, plaster, and the politics of reuse. Meanwhile, the search has not stayed inside KV62. Zahi Hawass and others have continued to look across the Theban landscape, especially in parts of the Valley of the Kings and nearby areas where undiscovered royal burials may still lie hidden. In recent years, claims that the search is close have returned to the news, including attention to work in the East Valley near the area of Hatshepsut's tomb. The language of being close is powerful, and it can be honest as a feeling born from experience, landscape reading, and excavation instinct. But it is not the same as proof. As of the latest public discussions, there is still no confirmed scholarly announcement that Nefertiti's tomb has been found. That distinction matters. Archaeology can be hopeful, but history must remain disciplined. A trench, an anomaly, or an experienced archaeologist's expectation is not yet a queen. The same caution applies to possible mummies. DNA testing has transformed the study of ancient royal families, but it has not magically solved Nefertiti. The female mummies, KV21A and KV21B, have drawn attention because of their possible relationships to the late 18th dynasty, and because one may connect genetically to the small mummified fetuses from Tutankhamun's tomb. But identification is a chain, and every weak link matters. Ancient DNA can be damaged. Samples can be incomplete. Family relationships can be interpreted in more than one way. Historical names must be matched to biological relationships that do not always carry labels. A mummy may be royal without being Nefertiti. A genetic relationship may indicate one woman while leaving another possible. The evidence remains incomplete, and no responsible account can present KV21A or KV21B as a confirmed Nefertiti. What makes the modern hunt so compelling is also what makes it dangerous. Nefertiti sits at the intersection of science, fame, nationalism, museum politics, tourism, and the human hunger for endings. A newly found tomb would be a discovery of enormous cultural force. It would reshape the public story of Amarna, Tutankhamun, and royal women in ancient Egypt. It would also draw the world's attention to Egypt in a way few archaeological discoveries could. That pressure can make every clue seem louder than it is. A possible chamber becomes almost a chamber. A mummy becomes almost identified. A theory becomes almost news. But the Queen has survived for more than 3,000 years by resisting almost. She requires the harder word confirmed. And so the hidden chambers and modern hunts leave the story suspended. Radar has looked through walls and found debate. Digital scans have found lines that may be architecture or illusion. Painted cartouches have suggested revisions that may be meaningful or overread. DNA has narrowed some family questions while leaving names uncertain. Excavations continue in the valley, and the desert still has spaces not fully understood. Nefertiti's absence has not defeated archaeology, but it has humbled it. The search has shown that the Queen's final secret may not yield to a single machine, a single wall, or a single dramatic announcement. It may require patience across disciplines, or it may be that the decisive evidence was broken, moved, or erased long ago. For now, the Queen remains just beyond the instrument's reach, not invisible, not found, but held in that narrow space where evidence ends and the desert begins again. Nefertiti's ending remains powerful because it does not behave like an ending. Ancient Egypt gives her a face that seems complete enough to cross time, a city that preserves the outline of her world and fragments of titles, crowns, gestures, and names that keep pulling her back into view. Then, at the exact point where a life should settle into death, burial, succession, and memory. The story refuses to close. The queen without a tomb is not simply an archaeological inconvenience. She's a reminder that even a civilization built around preservation could lose the final shape of one of its most visible women. Egypt carved names so the dead might live. It painted tomb walls so the afterlife could be navigated. It wrapped bodies, sealed chambers, and repeated rituals meant to defeat decay. Yet Nefertiti survives most strongly through the part of her story that decay has claimed. That is why her disappearance has become part of her power. If her tomb had been found long ago, clearly labelled and securely identified, the mystery would still be fascinating, but it would be contained. Archaeologists would study the burial, reconstruct the equipment, debate the inscriptions, and place her more firmly inside the sequence of late 18th dynasty history. Instead, Nefertiti remains open. She belongs partly to Amarna, partly to the Valley of the Kings, partly to Berlin, partly to the uncertain names of the succession, partly to the disputed walls of KV62, and partly to every silence left by the restoration that followed Akhenaten. Her absence allows the different fragments of her life to keep speaking to one another without resolving into a single final chamber. The Queen's story also exposes the fragility of royal memory. Nefertiti was not obscure. She was made visible with extraordinary care. Her body, name, and crown were used to support one of the boldest religious transformations in Egyptian history. She appeared under the Aten's rays as if she belonged to the very grammar of light. She stood beside Akhenaten in ritual, in family imagery, and possibly at the edge of kingship itself. Yet visibility did not protect her ending. If anything, it may have endangered it, because she was so closely tied to Amarna. She became vulnerable when Amarna became a problem to be solved. The same images that made her central to the Atene's world made her difficult for the restored order to remember honestly. There is a quiet lesson in that. Erasure does not always require the total destruction of a person. Sometimes it is enough to change the context around them, remove the city's sacred purpose, reuse the temple blocks, restore the old gods, change the names of the living, adapt the objects of the dead, omit certain rulers from official lists, let a generation pass, then another. Eventually, the person remains only in pieces, and the pieces no longer explain one another. This is what seems to have happened to the Amarna world. It was not erased completely. If it had been, Nefertiti would not haunt us. It was broken and redistributed. That is a more complicated kind of disappearance. The modern world often wants Nefertiti to be found because finding her would feel like justice. Her famous bust has made her seem intensely present, almost personally known, and that illusion creates a hunger for the rest of the story. A face asks for a body. A queen asks for a tomb. A name asks for a final inscription. But archaeology is not obliged to satisfy narrative desire. It follows what survives, and what survives in Nefertiti's case is both rich and insufficient. The bust found in a sculptor's workshop is not a biography. The Amarna reliefs are not a diary. The possible traces in Tutankhamun's tomb are not proof of hidden chambers. The KV-21 mummies are not confirmed identities. Claims of being close to discovery are not discoveries. The evidence remains incomplete, and the discipline required to say so is part of respecting her history. Still, uncertainty does not make the story empty. It makes it human. Nefertiti lived at a moment when Egypt tried to change the visible shape of divinity. The old hidden gods were pushed aside by a sun disk whose rays touched the royal family directly. A new city rose in the desert, bright with open courts and royal spectacle. A queen became one of the central faces of that experiment. Then the experiment faltered, and Egypt turned back toward older forms of order. In that turning back, some lives were preserved, some were rewritten, and some became nearly impossible to separate from the rubble. Nefertiti's vanishing is the human consequence of a political and religious collapse. It is what happens when a person's identity is fused to a world that later generations decide should not have existed. Her legacy, then, is not only beauty. Beauty is the most obvious part, the part that made her modern fame almost inevitable. But the deeper legacy is historical tension. Nefertiti forces us to ask what power looks like when it is shown through images rather than records of decisions. She forces us to ask how queenship could expand under unusual religious conditions. She forces us to ask how a woman might become almost king-like and still be difficult to identify at the end. She forces us to see Tutankhamun not only as a golden boy king, but as the inheritor of a damaged Amarna world whose objects, names, and burials may carry traces of those who came before him. She turns one of Egypt's most famous periods into something less polished and more unstable. And she remains, finally, a queen of fragments, a painted wall in one place, a reused block in another, a damaged inscription, a debated royal name, a workshop bust with one completed eye and one blank absence, a possible burial plan in Amarna's cliffs, a possible echo in the Valley of the Kings, a claim that rises, fades, and returns years later in another documentary, another excavation, another scan. None of these fragments is enough alone. But together they create a presence too strong to ignore. Nefertiti has not returned to us whole. She has returned as a pattern of survival and loss. The queen without an ending may one day receive one. A tomb may yet be found in the Theban cliffs. A mummy may one day be identified with stronger evidence. An inscription may emerge from storage, excavation, or a reused block and shift the balance of the debate. Archaeology has a long memory, and Egypt has often surprised those who thought its secrets were exhausted. But even if that discovery never comes, Nefertiti's vanishing will remain one of the clearest windows into the Amarna age. It shows the brilliance of the revolution, the danger of tying memory to ideology, and the strange afterlife of a woman whom history could neither keep fully nor erase completely. She stands at the edge of the record like the city she once ruled in light visible from far away, broken when approached, and still bright enough to make the desert seem unfinished. The search slows here, not because the mystery has been solved, but because the evidence has reached its quiet edge. Beyond that edge there is no need to force a final answer from the sand. Nefertiti belongs to a deep human pattern, older than Egypt and still alive now, the pattern of lives that shine intensely for a moment, then survive only through what chance allows to remain. A face, a name, a broken wall, a room that might have existed, a body that may have been moved. A story carried forward by people who cannot bear to leave it unfinished. In the long scale of time, even kings and queens become fragile. Their monuments crack, their titles lose their readers, their gods change names or fall silent. Cities built for eternity become low ridges in the dust. The Nile continues, the cliffs keep their shadows, and the desert covers what people once thought no one could forget. Nefertiti's world was made to look permanent, but its most sacred city lasted only a brief span before Egypt turned away. That briefness does not make it meaningless. It makes it sharper, like sunlight caught for one instant on gold before the chamber darkens again. Perhaps that is why Nefertiti still holds the imagination. She is close enough to see, but too far away to possess, Her image offers calm, symmetry, and control, while her history gives uncertainty, disruption, and loss. The contrast feels almost like the truth of ancient history itself. The past never comes back whole. It comes back in surfaces and silences, in things made carefully and things broken carelessly, in records that speak and records that stop just when they are needed most. So the Queen remains where the story found her, between Amarna's empty horizon and the hidden valleys of Thebes, between a museum face and an unnamed tomb, between royal power and human disappearance. The Aten city is quiet now. The offering tables are gone. The roads no longer carry the royal procession, but in the mind's eye, a figure still stands beneath the rays, crowned, composed, unfinished. Around her, the desert wind moves over stone and sand, and somewhere beyond the visible ruins, Egypt keeps the last part of her name in silence.